Hi, everyone. I'm Charvi. I'm a fifth-year machine learning PhD student, advised by Niharsha and Ken, Holstein and HCI. I'll be presenting some work on studies we conducted in peer review, where we are investigating bias in the conference peer review process. This is joint work with Ivan Stelmark, Ryan Lu, Shinwei Shen, Federico Eshenik, Shuchi Chawla, Marina Mela, and Nihar, my advisor. And I'll quickly give you a talk structure so you know what to expect. The first 10 minutes, since peer review might not be very familiar as an application domain to all of you, I'll go over an introduction and introduce you to the good, bad, and the ugly of peer review. The next 15 to 20 minutes, I will spend on the first study, which is on the role of archiving. We'll get to what that means. Then there'll be a short break for questions, and then another 15 to 20 minutes for the next part of the study. Feel free to ask any clarification questions in the middle. However, more detailed questions can wait for the break or the end of the talk. So, like I said, the introduction, what is peer review? For the uninitiated, some of you may have not submitted to a peer review process yet. In peer review, works of scientific research are evaluated by others with similar scientific expertise, your peers, before being approved for publication. We all encounter it in some part of our academic life where we submit to NeurIPS, ICML, iClear, or other conferences. But we all also have some problems with peer review. So why is good peer review important? Good peer review is important for the growth of scientific knowledge, where the science progresses through people deciding in the field what is good science and progressing on it or building upon it. As grad students or as faculty, we will be very familiar with the fact that the consequences of peer review drive our career trajectories. For instance, a paper being accepted or rejected can result in us being admitted in a PhD program, and so on and so forth for postdoc applications, professorship applications, and so on. Peer review has grown tremendously in the last couple of years, especially in the CS area, where we see that in these two graphs which I've shown you, NeurIPS and AAAI, which are two conferences in machine learning, have grown dramatically in the last 5 to 10 years, with NeurIPS and ICML still growing, NeurIPS and AAAI still growing. And so we need to make sure that these big conferences result in good peer review because we want to find the signal out of all of the noise. Lastly, peer review is also the deciding factor in how billions of dollars of funding is allocated in science. For instance, NSF and NIH both use peer review to decide whom to give funding to, which is very consequential. And current peer review may be slightly flawed or very, very flawed. So for this, I'll quote this researcher who has been working and is a contributing editor at JAMA, Journal of American Medical Association, and has been running the peer review congress for the past 30 years where they do research on peer review. They say that peer review is a human system which has many prejudices and biases because of the structure of the system, and is unscientific. And so they make a case for how we need to make peer review scientific again. If you do ML, since this is an AI seminar, ML is popularly known as a black box, where you put inputs into a machine learning model and you get an output, but you cannot explain why. Similarly, we can think about peer review as a black box, where you throw a paper submission in, something happens to the paper, and then we get a result or a reviewer response. But we are not exactly sure about what are the factors affecting our decision. So the perspective of our investigation is that the outcome of peer review, which I said the black box, should depend on intrinsic qualities of work, such as novelty, technical rigor, and contribution to field, etc. However, it should not depend on external factors, which is where the black box analogy again comes in. It should not depend on the author's identity. It should not depend on reviewer's self-interest. It should not depend on reviewer's identity, and so on and so forth. The extraneous factors that do not contribute directly to the quality of work. So in this work, the perspective that we take is to quantify and find statistical evidence for the effect of these extraneous factors in peer review, and then design policy or recommend policy design for decision making in peer review accordingly. So to give you a brief talk overview, we conducted 2 studies in peer review which investigate bias. The first is on the role of archiving in peer review process, and the second is on the role of citations. I will define both of those terms soon. However, I also want you to take a minute here to think about other different things that you may have ranted about or complained about in the peer review process while engaging with it, to understand or think about the different questions you would pose to peer review if you had the option to run studies like we have. So like I've been mentioning, we conducted studies in 2 peer review processes. Both the studies were conducted in these 2 conferences. The first one is ICML, which is the International Conference on Machine Learning. It's a huge flagship machine learning conference, runs once every year, and sees about 5,000 paper submissions and 3,000 reviewers. So this is a huge conference which covers all broadly connected fields in machine learning. And the second conference we ran the studies in is the Conference on Economics and Computation, which is a more niche conference with about 500 papers, 200 reviewers, focuses specifically on a sub-area called algorithmic economics. And so we kind of get to see both sides of the thing. We see a huge conference and we see a smaller field-specific conference. So since most of you may be new to peer review research, I wanted to quickly walk you through the research steps and challenges in conducting these studies in a process which is specifically to peer review. So the first part of the challenge is finding specific problems. We cannot fix peer review overnight, and we want to find what are the specific measurable outcomes that we can attack by asking specific questions. Careful study design is a very important part of peer review because, like I mentioned, peer review affects people's job trajectories and career outcomes. So we do not want to influence the decisions being made in the peer review process while still conducting the study, which may affect or take some extra effort from the reviewers and the paper writers in the peer review process. So we work in collaboration with program chairs of different peer review processes and design studies such that none of the main outcomes or main impacts of peer review are affected. The third part is analysis and inference from noisy observational data, which is where the statistics will come in and the causal inference will come in, because like we said, we cannot run randomized controlled trials in peer review since it's an important part of people's lives and we want to only see observational data. The fourth and last part is affecting change, where we work with program chairs to understand what are the different policy changes that are feasible in the space to correct for any biases we find. And this is still work in progress. Okay, so let's dive in. This will be the first study that I will be presenting to you. It's called To Archive or Not to Archive, which is a study quantifying pros and cons of posting preprints online. I'll define the terms soon. So the trends and policies in peer review have been as such that initially, especially in CS, initially review was single blind, where the reviewers could see the author's identity, but the author could not see the reviewer's identity. And this led to a lot of questions about whether the reviewer's evaluation of a paper was biased by the author's identity or affected in any way. In fact, a lot of research has found that single blind reviewing can lead to biases against women, against authors from smaller institutions, or positive bias in favor of famous authors. In fact, a study recently conducted found that if you just remove the famous author's name from a paper, the acceptance rate goes down. So naturally, we move to double-blind reviewing. However, I want to point out that many fields of science are still doing single blind reviewing. CS is one of the faster moving fields in that it has moved to double blind reviewing. And in double blind reviewing, the reviewer can see the author's cannot see the author's identity, and neither can the author see the reviewer's identity. So the idea was to have fixed this problem for disadvantaged authors who may be at a disadvantage if their identity is revealed to the reviewer. However, this was not a complete solution because now we have arXiv and Twitter and other social media avenues or e-repositories where people post their papers before publication. You must have seen people posting their work on arXiv on Twitter, saying that here is a thread explaining my recent work, or on arXiv where it's XYZ just published a preprint, and you get an email if you have subscribed to arXiv that this person just published a preprint. So this can lead to the dilution of de-anonymization, which we were expecting double blind to provide. So just to drive home that this is actually happening, in both EC 2021 and ICML 2021, about 1 in 3 papers were available online during the review process. So archiving is definitely a majority trend. So conferences have responded to this this growing trend of de-anonymization of work through the internet by different methods. For instance, CVPR has banned social media promotion of papers that are in the peer review process. ACL, which is the Computational Linguistics Conference, they have said that there is a 1-month anonymity period where you cannot talk about the paper on the internet or publish it on arXiv or anything of that sort. And on the other extreme, IEEE, Communication Letters has put a complete ban on any kind of archiving or social media sharing of the work which is still in the review process. So the conferences are trying to make sure that the anonymity of the paper remains intact, such that disadvantaged authors are not affected by this. However, what are the pros and cons for the disadvantaged authors that people are doing all of this for? Well, if you are a disadvantaged author, you would say that the pro of posting a preprint online is the publicity that your preprint is going to gain. You want your work to be known, you want people to build off of your work, and the peer review process can take anywhere between a couple months to a couple years. And so waiting that whole time for posting your preprint online could be harmful to your career almost. And like I mentioned earlier, the con is that you risk being de-anonymized and risk being subject to implicit biases by the reviewers who might know your identity. So since I gave you this big set of trends and policies, we wanted to formulate a research question which would help disadvantaged authors quantify their own pros and cons in posting preprints online. So we have a research question: quantify the positive and negative effects of posting preprints online in the peer review process of double-blind conferences for authors from lesser known institutions who we say are disadvantaged. So first, let's look at the con. We try to quantify the con if there is any real risk of being de-anonymized. So for this, we ran a survey, which was an anonymous survey in both EC and ICML, where we asked the reviewers if they searched for any of their assigned papers on the internet during the review process. This was an anonymous survey because people who may not answer truthfully if it was non-anonymous, because this is ideally supposed to be a bad thing to do. And the instructions emphasize that prior awareness and accident discovery of the paper do not count. And to everybody's surprise, including the program chairs, a staggering number of people look up papers online during the review process. In EC 2021, about 42%, which is almost 1 in 2, replied yes. And in ICML, 1 in 3 replied yes for looking up papers on the internet while they were reviewing them. So the con is quite dramatic, and that there is a high probability of papers being de-anonymized during the review process. So, well, we know that this con is skewed, and we now want to understand what is the skew in the pro. where do disadvantaged authors enjoy the same amount of positive benefits, which is publicity, from posting preprints online? They're already losing out in the con. So we want to see if they're also losing out in the pro. So we formulated the research question about what is the relation between the rank of the author's affiliation and the visibility of a preprint to its target audience, where target audience is members of the research community who are relevant to your field or might use your work. So our objective is to measure useful publicity gained by a paper. However, there are a lot of challenges. We do not have enough citations because these papers are just posted online, usually not more than a year before the conference. So the citations are not enough, but they're also noisy. Their views and downloads are also noisy because authors may have also contributed to the views and downloads, and for many days, for various reasons. And confidentiality was important to the program chairs because they did not want to run a public survey asking about whether people had seen this paper on the internet or used this paper before. So we had to run a survey within the conference. And the solution was that we matched papers that were available online during the review process to reviewers using the existing infrastructure of similarity scores, bids, and preferences, so that we could find relevant people in the reviewer community to match to papers. And we ran a survey where we asked each reviewer about 5 papers about whether they had seen this paper outside of reviewing context before. And so this included stuff like social media, Twitter, SSRN, archive, and workshops or talks and posters. And so if you recall that, our analysis was aimed at understanding if there is an effect of authors' institutional rank on the paper's visibility. And for this, we conducted a rank-based correlation test between the rank and the visibility outcomes. However, our analysis has confounders. And specifically, one may think of confounders as reasons that would explain the effect, which are not the true reason that we care about, which is the rank. So if there is a confounder and I find effect, if I don't account for the confounder, my claim may be wrong about finding any effect. So the first confounder we look at is time spent on archive. Now, naturally, you may think that if you spend more time on archive, if a paper spends more time on archive, it will see more publicity. And let's take the example that authors from top ranking institutions post their preprints earlier. Then we will see an effect, even though there is no effect of the rank on the paper's visibility. Second confounder is self-selection in preprints across authors from different institutions. Again, let's take an example where authors from top rank institutions post only high quality preprints, whereas top authors from lower rank institutions do not self-select the papers that they post online. And so in this setting, we will find an effect of rank on paper visibility, even though it's because of the fact that the high-ranked authors posted better preprints. And better preprints naturally will see more publicity. So we want to account for these confounders in our analysis. And the reason we have these 2 confounders here is because these are the measurable confounders we had in our data. However, we should always remember in any kind of effect analysis that there may be unmeasured confounders that we do not account for. So the first confounder was time spent on archive. So for this, we binned our responses based on time and assume that within a bin, which is small enough that a month or 2, the time does not have a direct effect on publicity. And we took weighted mean of the rank-based correlation coefficient. Confounder 2, which was self-selection in preprints, we looked at the data and saw that there was no significant evidence for confounder 2. So to understand how we did that, I have these 2 plots. We can focus in the beginning on the left plot, which is the ICML one. The x-axis is the ranking of the institutions, and the y-axis is the expectance rate of the papers. And we see that all ranking institutions have the same amount of self-selection for papers posted online. That is, yes, they do post papers online that are higher quality or more likely to get accepted, but there is no extra self-selection, that is the difference between the blue line and the red line, does not increase as we move from one side of the plot to the other. In EC, where we had much smaller sample size, about 400 to 500, we do not see any strong effect to tell us that there's a trend either way. So we discount EC and say that there is no significant evidence for confounding in ICML and EC. So we have accounted for our two confounders that we could measure. Now we're going to move on to the results, which is, was there an effect of author's institutional rank on paper visibility? And we found that indeed, authors from top ranked institutions enjoy higher visibility on preprints posted online. Specifically, again, I'm going to walk you through the two graphs for EC and ICML. On the left, we have ICML, which is, again, the x-axis is the ranking, and the y-axis is the visibility or the publicity, like I mentioned, enjoyed by a preprint. And we see that there is a weak statistically significant correlation of 0.06 with a p-value of 0.001, quality at 0.001, where the visibility is decreasing as the ranking increases. In fact, the top 10 ranked institutions enjoy a statistically higher visibility than the other remaining ranks. Similarly, in ICML, we see that the top 10 ranks enjoy statistically higher visibility than the lower ranks, but the correlation effect is not strong in that the p-value is 0.11. Again, EC is based on 500 responses, whereas ICML's plot is based on 7,500 responses. So we see that, well, the two main takeaways are that more than 30% of reviewers deliberately search for the assigned paper online, and that there's a weak correlation between the visibility enjoyed by a preprint and the associated author's institutional rank. Implications, it seems like it's like a win-win for CMU affiliated grad students, where you can have the cake and eat it too. And this is another reason that another way in which privilege kind of benefits more to the privileged people in the academic environment. So we argue that there's a need for clear conference policy defining acceptable reviewing practices. We found that in both EC and ICML, the burden for anonymization lied entirely with the authors. The reviewers were not told specifically anything about whether they should look up papers online or whether they should not. So one need is for clear conference policy for reviewers. And the second consideration we have is that one may consider uploading partially anonymized preprints on archive, where they can enjoy the publicity, but also maybe not get de-anonymized, maybe by changing the title of the paper. So that's the first study that we have, where we look for bias based on author's identity in the peer review process. And I'm happy to take questions.
I just have a clarifying question. I think the last slide answered it, but the plot that you showed 2 slides ago, the x-axis is ranking of the institution.
Mm-hmm.
And how do you get those two?
So for ICML, we got it from like past submissions. So we looked at ICML 2020 and we saw which institutes were had the most submissions accepted, and ICML 2020 has the data. EC, we just went by CS and QS rankings for economics and computation. There was a specific subfield in the CS rankings for that. And then we worked with the program just to make sure that they agreed with it, in case some schools were missing. Yes.
Is there a possibility that like more visibility for famous authors versus like being determined issue? Like we're already famous, there's I have a lot of visibility on the paper, but it's like an author, like an unknown author is trying to get famous, they get a lot more visibility from like even very small amount of.
Oh, so you're talking about the utility of visibility. Here we specifically thought about visibility as also just like building upon your work. Like you can think of it as a citation almost. Like I know that the utility to let's say Michael Jordan is not anymore in the citations or that they're getting. But here we are talking about these measurable normative things that one citation is just as important to both the people. But that's a good point. It's Utility is a different thing here, and we're measuring objective outcomes. Define visibility.
Yeah.
So if you mentioned, if you remember, we conducted this survey. Sorry. This survey where we asked reviewers specifically if they had seen these papers, which they were not reviewing outside of reviewing contexts, such as social media, archive, SSRN, or talks and posters. And that's what we are quantifying as visibility. If they answer yes, they have, that's a response of yes, 1 for visibility versus 0 if they respond no. And then we take average visibility for papers depending on the responses they've received.
So if one paper is 74 reviewers, you look at the average of 1 reviewers.
No, so each response is a different response. We think about papers as each paper reviewer responds to be a single unit. We're not averaging over papers.
But for one given paper, the 4 reviewers said 3 of them have seen it and 1 haven't.
Yeah.
That would be 0.75.
No, it would just be 4 different samples with 1, 1, 1, 0 in it. Because again, in the peer review space, you don't get that many samples to begin with. So we do not say that a paper is a representative sample. We say a paper reviewer pair is a representative sample.
Can I ask a question?
Yes.
Oh yeah, so I guess like it's probably slightly out of scope, but I guess like so if one motivation for publishing on archive is that they want more publicity, then so do you know if we compare, say, SML and iClear, where for iClear the papers are already on open, so like are already online even though they are anonymized? In that case, would people be less incentivized to put on archive?
Oh, you're talking about open review?
Right.
That's an interesting question. Yeah, we haven't included that or thought about that, about like what are people's opinions on publicity of a de-anonymized submission versus a anonymized submission. Because again, I think credit for work is an important part of the publicity one is gaining. Like they built upon my work, they did not build upon any work on the internet. But that would be a third question to ask. Like as a potential policy consideration, one should consider reviewer authors' preferences, whether they want to upload anonymized versions of their paper and are just okay with that, to see if that's a solution. But I'm not sure about that. I think there is some credit involved in this.
Cool, thank you.
When you asked whether the reviewers looked at the papers or not, they probably have a incentive to not retrieve them.
Exactly.
So it's probably much higher than before.
So if you see that, yeah, I completely agree that it's possible that the effect is even stronger than it is. But however, the surprising part is it's already so strong. We saw 42% and 50. You should also look at the response rates. About 90 people responded in EC 2021, and about 1/6 of 700 people responded in ICML 2021, which is a smaller fraction of the actual conference size. So if we went and made sure everybody responded, it's only going to grow. Because it's more likely that people who did not respond are the ones who are also participating in such practices.
May I ask a question on Zoom, please?
Okay, 1 second. Yes.
Did you find any data on the citations of papers that were archived only as opposed to those that were published in conferences? Specifically, I'm wondering whether conferences are going to become irrelevant because the volume is untenable.
Oh, that's a interesting and separate question. It's a great question, and I'm also, as a person who does research and peer review, thinks about what is the conference's role in peer review, because archive can substitute in a large fashion for the different things that the peer review process is providing. And that's an interesting question to consider for later. Okay, that's the last question I'll take, and then I'll move on.
Do you have a sense for why reviewers search for reviews online? I think there's two different explanations. One is like their curiosity and they just want to know the good and that influences the explorer. Another is they would be very interested in the reviews, for example, or even reviews, like maybe a shortcut to the reviewing process, like it's for getting cookies.
That's a good question. So I have some anecdotal evidence because once we found these results, I did ask some friends if they're doing this. And what I kind of got the response to be was like, let's say I'm being lazy and I want to review a paper, but it's by John Kleinberg. I'm not gonna like say bad things, that many bad things about it. Like I'm not gonna be super critical or spend time trying to be critical about it, right? John Kleinberg is a famous researcher who does a lot of great work. So once I find out that he's on the author list, my review tasks have kind of simplified. So that's part of the first reason, like you mentioned, like if I know it's a famous author, I can be easily lenient to the paper and like at least shave some of the responsibility off. Open review is a newer thing in this space. EC specifically has no place where people might have submitted to open review. So maybe that's not the consideration for people in EC, but maybe for ICML it is that. If NeurIPS is had the first open review iteration this time, right? So maybe increasingly that might be the reason, but I don't know, not yet.
So I guess
Yeah, so yeah. Yes. For sure. Lots of issues in the peer review process. So all the other questions I can take after because I do have to move on to the second part of this talk, which is coming right up. So the second question, again, I would like to remind you that we are thinking about what are these extraneous factors which are affecting the peer review process, which one would imagine ideally shouldn't. So here we look for citation bias in the peer review process, and I'll define citation bias in a bit. And we're calling this work sightseeing and reviewing. I'm quite proud of the title. So the motivation for this work is, as grad students who write papers, you might have thought about what is the role of citations in peer review. I'm going to give you a second to read that. And like, if there is a work, if there is an area or a work where you can cite 10 papers, do I cite all the 10 papers? Do I cite one of the 10 papers? Which one? Unclear. Anyway, here in this work, we're talking about bad stuff. So citations are often misused. We all know of cases where including citations to journal editors or potential reviewers will help a paper's chances of being accepted for publication in a specific journal. So this is the anecdotal evidence. However, even in surveys, the survey performed in Will Hyde in 2017 found that 40% of authors would preemptively pad their papers with citations in certain cases just so that they can get accepted. And so let's consider there are two ways in which citation bias can manifest. One is where they're explicitly stating, like let's say the reviewer is Rick, they're saying that please cite works of Rick et al. And you might have seen that happen to you, where even the surveys say that 20% of researchers get coercive citations from reviewers. And specifically, there was a shocking incident where an editor of a journal coerced authors to cite more than 30 of their papers. And so this is the explicit manifestation of this bias. However, we are looking at the implicit bias, where let's say there's submission number 42, where Morty et al. Have been cited, and reviewer 2 happens to be Morty, and they accept the paper for blah reasons. However, one of them implicitly was the fact that they were cited. And that's a bad thing. We do not want that to happen. So we pose the following research question, where you consider the reviewer Morty, and there are two versions of the submission, submission number 42, where in the top one, if you notice, Morty Smith is cited, and in the lower one, he isn't. And so what first I want to clarify the assumption that we are going into this with, that these are two equally good versions of the paper. That is, citing Morty Smith in the upper version is not adding to the objective quality of the paper. And in these two scenarios, if the first paper is accepted and the lower paper is rejected, then that's what we're calling citation bias. So we have the motivation. So we work with program chairs again, because like I mentioned, we have to do some kind of intervention usually to conduct our study. In this work, the intervention was to make sure that in the paper reviewer matching stage, where reviewers are matched to papers, there are some reviewers for each paper that are cited. So there's at least one reviewer that is cited. And like I mentioned earlier, that we can't just do anything in this paper matching process, where we can't just be like, okay, how about we match that person, this person, they have no relevant expertise. No, in other conferences or other fields, there are situations where cited researchers are sought as reviewers in other. So this method of matching reviewers was good enough or did not affect the quality of the matching. And now moving on to the analysis. So prior approach of studying citation bias has been to just compare mean scores given by the pool of cited reviewers and the uncited reviewers, and a difference in the mean scores indicates citation bias. However, this approach will not work or lead to false claims, because several confounding factors may lead this analysis to give false conclusions. And that's where, again, our statistics and our analysis of the confounding factors comes in. This is observational data. So we find that there are three main confounders: paper quality, reviewer attributes such as reviewer expertise, reviewer seniority, reviewer preferences, and genuinely missing citations. And I'll explain each one of them in detail. Paper quality, you can imagine as the paper quality increases, the probability of the reviewer being cited increases, because like we said, we match papers to reviewers who have some relevant expertise in the domain. Similarly, on the other hand, as paper quality increases, naturally the score increases. So if paper quality is not accounted for, our analysis will break false alarm guarantees. The second confounding factors were the reviewer attributes, such as reviewer expertise, reviewer seniority, and reviewer preferences. I'll give you one example of how these attributes can confound using the expertise as an example. As reviewer expertise increases, again, the probability of being cited of the reviewer increases, because they might have a lot of research work in that domain. And we have also seen in peer review that as reviewer expertise increases, people are more lenient and more accepting of like new work or novel work or new ideas, which may not be as well accepted by less expert, people with lower expertise. And so again, here expertise can cause be a confounding factor and lead to false conclusions. Genuinely missing citations, and this is the one I was trying to also tell you about when I said that the two versions of the paper are equally good. We're saying that when important prior work by a reviewer is not cited, that's a genuine reason for them to decrease the score. And hence, that should not be considered in an analysis, because that reason is not the same as the implicit bias we're talking about, which is citation bias. And so, as an example, consider this scenario where the cited reviewer says, my work is adequately cited, I don't see any missing references. However, the uncited reviewer does see that their work is not cited, and so they are more likely to reduce the score because of this asymmetry in information, where the cited reviewer may be unaware of works by the uncited reviewer. So I've explained all the confounding factors to you, and now we're going to go into the details of how we account for those. So to account for paper quality, the challenge is that paper quality is unobserved. One may suggest that reviewing outcomes such as paper acceptances or rejections are paper quality, good proxies of paper quality, but we know that the peer review is noisy and they are not. So paper quality is unobserved, and we want to look at the difference in cited and uncited reviewers scores per paper to test for bias. And this difference is independent of paper quality now. For confounding factor, which was the genuinely missing citation, these are hard to detect automatically. And so in both conferences, we had asked program chairs to add a question to the reviewer response where the reviewers were asked to mention if this paper was missing important citations. And then we read the reviews to exclude the submissions where important citations were missing, and we deemed them to be important. In EC, there were 286 such papers, so we could read through. And then with collaborations with program chairs, we identified 3 genuinely missing citations, which we threw out, which also goes on to show that out of 300 papers, 3 citations where the reviewers mentioned citations were missing were actually genuine. Again, in ICML, we had about 1,031 papers, and we did not have the manual bandwidth to go over all these papers. So we subsampled about 100 papers from this and found that 5% had genuinely missing citations. So we chose not to account for them or chose not to take any action, since this was a small enough number. For the remaining confounding factors, which are related to reviewer attributes, we found and collected reviewer data that captured these confounders. For expertise, we had self-reported expertise and confidence. For seniority, we had classification of reviewers into senior and junior from the program chairs. And for reviewer preferences, we had their bids. So now let's move on to the analysis, because we did a lot of data processing already. The first analysis assumes a linear modeling assumption, where we say that the score given by a cited reviewer subtracted by the score given by the unsighted reviewer can be modeled as the coefficient alpha star and a linear function of the difference in the confounding factors, which are the reviewer attributes. And so note that here we have also taken care of paper quality, also taken care of genuinely missing citations by throwing them out in EC. And now our test will say that there is citation bias if alpha star is greater than 0 and sigma is not 0, and there's statistical significance to that. However, this is a linear analysis, and always there is the question of model misspecification, since linear is a very specific kind of model. So we conducted a non-parametric analysis, but this was way harder in EC because it was a small sample size. So we matched all cited and uncited reviewers on all confounding factors, which is quality, expertise, preference, seniority. Again, the genuinely missing citations were excluded. And so this is basically saying find a paper such that 2 reviewers have the same expertise, same seniority, and same preference, and one is cited and the other is not cited. So obviously we're not able to do this in EC because not enough papers were left. But in ICML, we had about 60 papers, which is a big deal. And so we found that we tested for difference within the matched pairs to test for the presence of citation bias. And the results are out. So yes, there is citation bias in peer review. In fact, there's considerable citation bias in peer review. In EC, we found that the expected increase in score due to citation bias is about 0.23 on a scale of 0.5. And in ICML, it's about an increase of 0.16 on a 6-point scale. And now these are both statistically significant, like you can see the p-values are very small. But you might wonder what is the 0.3's value. And we saw that in both the confidences, a 1-point increase in a single reviewer score improves the position of a submission by 11%. So for a big chunk of people who are on the border, where they're just between accept and reject, this could make the difference. And the non-parametric analysis, which worked around the linear modeling assumptions, also yielded the same conclusion in terms of presence of citation bias. So the main takeaways are that reviewers are implicitly biased in favor of papers that they're cited in. They find evidence of citation bias in both ICML and EC. And we advocate for the need for policies to fix citation bias. The first policy recommendation being make reviewers and area chairs, importantly, aware of this finding, where area chairs are aware of whether the reviewer who's giving their score is cited or not cited. The second is to balance it out, where you assign both cited and uncited reviewers to all papers and ensure that this is maintained for all papers so that all papers get a fair chance. So I presented you 2 studies out of many which could be conducted in peer review. where we found evidence of bias due to citations and archiving of papers. And we advocate for policy reform to make peer review fair and scientific. And I would encourage you to think about this as 2 out of many, in that there are more questions to be asked in peer review, and this is just the set of questions we ask, but there are more questions and more studies to be done to make peer review better.